Shadows of Christmas. Before we dive in, smash that subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment if you think you could survive a Christmas behind steel doors, because what happens here is darker than you can imagine. The sun had long disappeared behind the jagged mountains of Colorado, and the freezing wind whipped across the razor wire fences surrounding ADX Florence. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed like distant cries, reflecting off polished concrete walls and steel doors. Inmate number 4321 pressed his face against the cold glass of his cell door, counting the hours until the holiday meal. 24 Christmases behind these walls, and the taste of hope had become bitter, like the metal of his fork. In the hallway, guards moved silently, glances sharp, weapons holstered but ready. Officer Ramirez adjusted his flashlight, scanning the cells with a practiced attachment. A whisper from a cell, almost inaudible, cut through the quiet. "Did you hear that?" Nearby, a younger inmate stared at a crumpled photograph of his daughter, now 10 years old. The tears came silently, tracing icy rivulets across his dirt-streaked face. The cafeteria was a study in contrasts. Trays of lukewarm turkey, canned green beans, and gelatin desserts lined up for 400 inmates. Yet the silence was deafening, the absence of family heavier than any chain. At 7:13 p.m., a faint commotion stirred near cell block B. A package, illegal, carefully smuggled, had appeared on a shelf no one had noticed before. Guards froze. Prisoners whispered in anticipation. But the package wasn't the gift anyone expected. Inside, a handwritten note revealed the darkest truth yet. Someone had betrayed one of the oldest inmates, leaking secrets about a hidden alliance that could upend the fragile balance of survival. By the time the clocks ticked toward 8 p.m., the quiet corridors vibrated with tension. Some inmates smiled weakly at the sight of a tattered Christmas card slid under their doors. Others clenched fists, knowing that even a small act of kindness could trigger jealousy, fights, or worse. Number 4321 felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado winter. Then, as the shadows deepened, a sudden lockdown announcement crackled over the intercom. All inmates secure. Movement restricted. Repeat, lockdown in effect. In that instant, the narrow line between routine and chaos dissolved. A hidden feud flared to life. The very walls seemed to hum with anticipation, the scent of fear mixing with the faint aroma of canned turkey. And at the end of the hall, a small revelation. Someone had intercepted letters, stolen photographs, manipulated trust, hinted that this Christmas would not be remembered for food or fleeting cheer, but for secrets, betrayal, and the kind of silence that devours hope. Some inmates stopped counting holidays altogether. Midnight without mercy. The lockdown sealed ADX Florence into something tighter than silence. Steel doors clanged shut in sequence, each echo rolling down the corridors like a slow drumbeat. Christmas night pressed forward, minute by minute, and with it came the kind of tension that turned thoughts inward and trust into a liability. Inmate 4321 sat on the edge of his bunk, the intercom's last announcement still vibrating in his ears. Lockdown to routine, but this one felt different. The timing was wrong. Christmas nights were supposed to be predictable. Minimal movement, fewer staff, a fragile truce between men who had nothing left to lose. Tonight, the truce was already broken. Across cell block B, the younger inmate with the crumpled photograph noticed something missing. The photo was gone. He searched the concrete floor, the thin mattress, even the narrow slit beneath the door where Christmas cards sometimes slid through. Nothing. His breathing quickened. In ADX, possessions were identity. Losing one meant someone had been inside his world without permission. Officer Ramirez paused at the end of the corridor, listening. Years on night duty had taught him that danger rarely announced itself. It hid in patterns that didn't quite match. One inmate pacing instead of sleeping. Another sitting too still. A hand hovering near a slot in the door, waiting. The smuggled package discovered earlier had already triggered a quiet internal response. Supervisors reviewed camera feeds, rewinding the same moments over and over. No one had seen the package arrive. It had simply appeared, like a deliberate insult to the system. The handwritten note inside wasn't just betrayal. It was leverage. Names, dates, coded references to favors owed and debts unpaid. Old alliances, long buried, were suddenly exposed. Inmate 4321 understood immediately what that meant. Information was currency, and someone had just flooded the market. Down the tier, a man known for keeping to himself began tapping softly on his wall, a rhythm barely audible. It wasn't random. It was a message. Another wall answered. The sound traveled cell to cell, a whispering network activated under the cover of lockdown. Guards heard only silence. The inmates heard everything. In the control room, a technician frowned at the monitors. 2 cameras flickered, then stabilized. Probably nothing. Still, he made a note. Christmas staffing was lean, and probably nothing was how mistakes were born. The younger inmate finally sank to the floor, back against the door, his hands trembling. The photo had been his anchor. Without it, the years ahead felt suddenly infinite. He pressed his forehead to the steel and whispered his daughter's name, hoping the walls would remember it if he couldn't. At 10:47 p.m., a guard found a folded piece of paper pushed halfway out from a food slot. No signature, no threats, just a sentence written in careful, deliberate letters. You miss one. The phrase spread quietly among staff. Miss one what? A camera? A package? A person? Officer Ramirez returned to cell block B, his steps measured. He stopped outside 4321 cell. The older inmate met his gaze through the glass, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Ramirez felt a familiar unease crawl up his spine. Men like to survive by seeing farther than everyone else. You expecting trouble? Ramirez asked, his voice low. 4321 didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. It's already here. Elsewhere, a maintenance hatch that hadn't been opened in years sat ajar by less than an inch. Inside, hidden from cameras and casual inspection, was a small bundle of letters, Christmas cards, photographs, personal messages intercepted and collected over months. Someone had been building a private archive of other men's lives, and tonight it was about to be used. At 11:32 p.m., alarms did not sound. That was the most unsettling part. Instead, a series of internal alerts flashed quietly on control screens. Missing items, irregular movement logs, a staff member unaccounted for, last seen heading toward an administrative corridor that should have been empty. The prison felt as though it was holding its breath. Inmate 4321 lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He had stopped counting Christmases years ago, but tonight marked something else. An ending or a beginning. He thought of the alliances he had refused, the secrets he had kept, and the one decision he had made decades ago that still echoed through these walls. As the clock crept toward midnight, a supervisor finally authorized a targeted sweep. Doors remained sealed, but something was moving beneath the surface, reshaping the balance of power cell by cell. Then a message appeared on the central monitor, typed from a terminal that required clearance no inmate should have had access to. Midnight changes everything. And somewhere deep inside ADX Florence, while the rest of the world counted down to joy, someone prepared to collect a debt that had waited 25 Christmases to be paid. When hope goes quiet, midnight arrived without bells, without countdowns, without mercy. Inside ADX Florence, the clocks ticked forward as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. The supervisor ordered the sweep to begin slowly, methodically. No shouting, no rushing. This prison had learned the hard way that panic favored the inmates. Doors stayed sealed while teams moved through corridors meant only for staff. Flashlights cut thin beams across concrete, illuminating dust that had settled into corners untouched for years. Every step echoed like a confession. They found the missing staff member first. Officer Hale lay slumped in a narrow administrative hallway, conscious but disoriented, wrists bound with zip ties taken from a maintenance kit. His eyes fluttered when the med team knelt beside him. No blood, no visible injuries, just fear, raw and shaking. He kept apologizing. Hale whispered once he could speak. Said he didn't want, but he owed them. Owed them? Who was a question no one wanted answered out loud. The terminal used to send the midnight message was traced within minutes. It wasn't hacked from outside. It hadn't been breached digitally. It had been accessed physically, using credentials lifted months earlier during routine inspections. A slow crime, a patient one, the kind that only worked inside a place where time itself felt endless. Inmate 4321 heard the boots before he heard the alarms. Heavy, coordinated, close. He sat up calm, almost relieved. For years, he had lived knowing this moment would come. He had built a survival around it. When the door finally opened, the lights were blinding. Stand up, hands visible, a voice commanded. He complied without hesitation. They escorted him past cells filled with watching eyes. No words were exchanged, but messages traveled anyway. Some inmates felt satisfaction. Others felt dread. Power was shifting, and nobody knew where it would land. In the interview room, the supervisor placed a bundle of letters on the table. Christmas cards, photographs, notes written in careful handwriting, some dated decades earlier. Evidence of stolen hope, cataloged and controlled. You collected these, the supervisor said. 4321 nodded once. I protected them. By hoarding them? By deciding when they mattered. The truth came out slowly, like cold air leaking through a cracked door. Years ago, a group of inmates had formed an information network, trading secrets for protection, favors, and silence. Family connections, guard weaknesses, emotional pressure points. Christmas, with its rituals and vulnerabilities, had been their most productive season. But the network had fractured. Greed replaced loyalty. And when someone tried to expose the system, 4321 had stepped in, not to stop it, but to redirect it. He took everything. Names, proof, leverage. He waited. Why now? The supervisor asked. 4321 looked at the letters. Because Christmas makes people careless. Even here, in cell block B, the younger inmate sat on his bunk, staring at the empty space where his photograph had been. The lockdown lights flickered once, then steadied. He assumed the night would pass like all the others, quiet and unresolved. Then, without warning, a small envelope slid through the slot at the base of his door. His hand shook as he picked it up. Inside was a photograph, untouched, and beneath it, a note written in the same careful handwriting. Something should never be used as currency. Tears came before he could stop them. He pressed the photo to his chest, the concrete suddenly less cold, the silence less cruel. By 2:17 a.m., the sweep was over. The maintenance hatch was sealed. The network dismantled. Several inmates were moved to deeper isolation, their privileges reduced to nothing. Officer Hale was transported out under guard, alive but forever changed. 4321 was returned to his cell just before dawn. No charges yet. No promises either. In ADX Florence, survival was often its own sentence. He lay back on his bunk as the first hint of morning light filtered through the narrow window. Another Christmas had passed. Another reckoning survived. Down the tier, the tapping had stopped. The walls were quiet again. In the control room, the supervisor filed a final report. The incident would be classified, the details restricted. The public would never hear about the midnight message, the stolen letters, or how close the prison had come to something worse. That was how ADX worked. It swallowed stories whole. As breakfast trays slid silently into cells, Christmas officially ended inside the prison. No announcements, no acknowledgments, just routine returning like it always did. Inmate 4321 closed his eyes. He no longer marked holidays, but he remembered everyone. Tonight had reminded him why. Hope, he had learned, was dangerous, but so was forgetting it entirely. Somewhere far beyond the walls, families were still celebrating, unaware how thin the line between order and chaos had been just hours earlier. Inside ADX Florence, the silence reclaimed its throne. And if this story stayed with you longer than you expected, remember, there are more truths buried behind locked doors. You know what to do before the next one begins.